As night fell on the 5th of June 1944, a vast armada of Allied ships was steaming across the English Channel, its destination the beaches of Normandy in northwestern France. Above flew hundreds of bombers and fighters. At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of the 6th of June, the warships opened fire on the coast ahead. The German defenders ran to their positions as the bombardment increased in intensity. Landing craft began to make for the shore. Shortly after 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft beached, and their ramps came down. It was the culmination of nearly 4 years of planning and preparation. As early as the summer of 1940, when Britain stood alone, Prime Minister Winston Churchill had realized that only by re-entering continental Europe could the Axis powers be ultimately defeated. It was with this in mind that in June 1940 he ordered the formation of the Commandos, seen here raiding the Norwegian Lofoten Islands in March 1941. He also set up the Directorate of Combined Operations to develop the art of amphibious warfare. But only active American help could ensure a successful assault on Fortress Europe. Hence Churchill's wooing of President Roosevelt during 1940 and 1941. The surprise Japanese attack on the Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 finally brought America into the war, but initially only against Japan. This placed Roosevelt in a dilemma as to what to do about Germany and Italy. In the event, Hitler and Mussolini solved the problem by declaring war on the United States on the 11th of December. 2 days later, Churchill sailed to meet Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. for what was to be the first of the great Allied war conferences. It was codenamed Arcadia. Even though the Japanese were sweeping all before them, Arcadia upheld a policy decision made early in 1941 that when and if America entered the war on Britain's side, priority would be given to the defeat of Germany. To this end, the Americans were to send troops to Britain for an offensive operation in Western Europe. But there was a divergence of opinion as to where to strike. The British wanted to complete the clearance of North Africa, including Vichy French Northwest Africa, before attacking Europe itself. The Americans favored direct action against continental Europe. Eventually 3 operations were agreed. One, Gymnast, was an invasion of French Northwest Africa, which would link up with the British 8th Army thrusting west through Libya. The second was to be an invasion across the English Channel in 1943, codenamed Roundup. Finally, if German pressure on Russia became unbearable, the British and Americans would launch Operation Sledgehammer somewhere in Western Europe. The first American troops landed in Britain, in Northern Ireland, at the end of January 1942. By the end of June, some 55,000 American troops had arrived in Britain, and the US 8th Air Force was also sent there. Their arrival gave the British people an enormous boost to morale. The Americans were like beings from another planet to drab, war-weary Britain. Their seemingly endless supplies of chewing gum, candy bars and nylon stockings, as well as their dancing ability, acted as a magnet to British women. Their menfolk were sometimes a little less enthusiastic. Overpaid, oversexed, and overhere was the rueful comment. Fearful that Russia might be forced to make a separate peace with Germany, American agitation to strike early at continental Europe increased. In Britain, left-wing elements also began to press for the early opening of a second front. The Russians too argued that large Anglo-American forces being built up in Britain could not stand idle for long. Russia was having to face the bulk of Germany's military might, and she must have direct help. The British military planners were less sanguine. They had now spent 18 months examining plans for attacking Fortress Europe. There had also been commando raids to gather information. A successful cross-channel operation required both air supremacy over the landing area and sufficient amphibious shipping, both to land a sizable force and to maintain it. Neither of these conditions existed in the spring of 1942. Yet as the German summer 1942 offensive got underway, Russian pleas for a second front increased. The British believed that any major operation to assist the Russians would merely weaken the main invasion scheduled for 1943. The best they could offer was a 24-hour raid on Dieppe, the French channel port. But Roosevelt was keen that US troops should be in combat in Europe before the end of 1942. Otherwise, public opinion might force him to switch priority to the Pacific. Consequently, he consented to Gymnast, the invasion of French Northwest Africa. American General Dwight Eisenhower was placed in charge of Gymnast. In the meantime, the Anglo-American bomber offensive against Germany, as yet still in embryo, and Lend-Lease weapons supplies were all that could be done to help Russia. The British raid on Dieppe was eventually mounted in August 1942. It was officially described as a reconnaissance in force. But the operation turned out to be a disaster. The Germans were expecting such a raid, and the Canadian division involved, whose first combat experience this was, failed to get off the beach. The Canadians lost half their strength, killed or captured. Their sacrifice demonstrated only too starkly that the Allies were in no way ready to mount a major cross-channel attack. One of the many lessons learned was that a landing at a defended port was unlikely to be successful. In contrast, the French Northwest African landings went ahead successfully in November 1942, with the Vichy French offering little resistance. The landings were followed by the winter campaign in Tunisia. In January 1943, at the height of the Tunisian campaign, Churchill and Roosevelt, together with their military staffs, met at Casablanca in Morocco. A number of crucial decisions were reached. Foremost was that the war could only be ended with the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. The next major operation in Europe was to be the capture of Sicily. This meant that the cross-channel invasion was now not feasible for 1943, but the build-up of American forces in Britain would continue.